All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar from the Center for Climate and Security, a research institute of the Council on Strategic Risks. My name is Erin Sikorsky, and I am the director of the Center for Climate and Security. And really glad that you've joined us for this conversation today on the Iran war and the nexus with food, water, and energy security issues. We've got really an all-star group of experts here with us for this conversation as we think about understanding and navigating the complex cascading risks at the intersection of this crisis. It's presenting multiple systemic challenges on multiple levels, whether at the state, the region, or globally. We're only going to talk about three of them today, and we only have an hour, so I'm sure we'll just scratch the surface, but we're really going to look at water, at food, and at energy. I wanted to say a little something since we are the Center for Climate and Security, right? Climate change is not a key driver of this conflict by any stretch of the imagination, but this conflict is amplifying risks associated with climate stress and weakening future capacity to manage climate strains, both in the region and globally, especially as we think about the impacts on food and water. And of course, at the same time, the energy story here, which we'll get into, I think helps underscore the risks of fossil fuel dependencies and the co-benefits of the transition to clean energy, not only for climate, but also for resilience in the face of these kind of shocks. So, with that, I'm going to introduce our panelists and then turn to each of them for just very brief remarks to kick things off, and then we'll move to Q&A. I've got questions of my own, but all of the attendees, I encourage you to start now putting questions in the box, and we can go from there. Again, and just a reminder, this is being recorded. It is on the record, and so keep that in mind. We're really happy today to be joined by five great folks from the CCS universe, either serving as staff or non-resident fellows or advisory board members of the organization. We've got Cullen Hendricks, who is also a senior fellow with the Peterson Institute of Economics here in Washington, D.C. We've got Swati Veeravalli, who serves on our advisory board and is the former director for climate and security on the National Security Council under the last administration. We've got Marcus King, who is a professor of the practice at Georgetown University and associated with the Earth Commons and the environmental security program there, which he leads. And then we've got Peter Schwartzstein, who is author of a book I can see right on my shelf here called The Heat and the Fury. If you haven't read it, you should. And an expert on all things climate security, particularly in the Middle East. And then last but not least, we have my colleague, Tom Ellison, who serves as the deputy director of the Center for Climate and Security and has done a lot of great analytic work in recent years looking at climate security challenges in Iran in particular. So let me turn it over to Cullen to kick things off for us, and then we'll move down the line. So Cullen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Erin. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. I'm going to kick off with a few remarks about energy security. The near-term energy security story is being very widely told. The Strait of Hormuz is effectively closed. Oil and gas infrastructure has been directly targeted in the strikes so far. Prices have spiked, but risk premia, at least for oil, seem to be dissipating at present. That story is all real, and that story is all very serious. But I'd like for you to a moment to imagine that you are a first responder at a car crash. You've got a victim that's bleeding from a large cut on their forehead. It's very visible, it's dramatic, and it's getting all of the attention. But that's not what's in danger of killing them. What's in danger of killing them is the internal bleeding that you can't see on the surface. In this analogy, oil markets are the cut. What I would like to talk about is the internal bleeding. And I'm going to focus on sort of three second-order implications of what we're seeing now. The first is that Europe is heading into its gas stocking season at about 60% of the LNG reserves it had this time last year. Physical markets are, of course, very tight. Prices are extremely high. And Europe may go into next winter dangerously understocked. That's not just a heating bill story, which is something that we think about at CCS. It's also a Ukraine war story and a European reindustrialization and rearmament story. And Europe is competing with Asia in tight LNG spot markets right now. The second is that this isn't just an energy story, it's an industrial chemicals and fertilizer story. The Gulf produces nearly half of the world's sulfur, which is disproportionately more than its share of oil, which you've been hearing so much about, because sulfur is a byproduct of refining sour crude. Now, that sulfur becomes sulfuric acid, which is helpful in turning copper ore into copper wire and phosphate rock into phosphate based fertilizer. Miners and processors are already saying that they may run out of acid within weeks. And that's going to be competing directly with uses that farmers need that are heading into the planting season, at least in the Northern Hemisphere. Oil is relatively geographically diversified, which is why you'll see that risk premia evaporate relatively quickly, assuming there's a change in the Strait of Hormuz. Those petrochemicals, however, are much less so. And then the third, and I think this is kind of a meta framing point, is the fiscal crisis that is looming for countries that are both food and fuel import dependent. Fuel prices and energy prices anchor all other prices in the economy, including food prices. So if you're Pakistan or Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or Ethiopia, and you have limited or no reserves, very little flexibility, you're already under strain. For these countries, this isn't just an inflation story, it's a food security and political stability story. So the near term shock, the cut on the forehead, is very painful, but the medium term damage is going to be more sustained and harder to address. I'll stop there, Aaron. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. That was excellent. And thanks for getting us out of that kind of, what's right in front of us headspace and looking more broadly. Swati, let me turn to you now.
Yeah, thanks. It's so great to be here and with my co-panelists and I'm looking forward to the dialogue today. Colin, it's hard to follow up that very visceral imagery of the bleeding gash on the forehead, but I'm going to go with it and I really take your internal bleeding to perhaps another level. And for me, I think, for decades, resource security, particularly in the Gulf, has largely been understood through the lens of oil, right? We're not here to debate that. And also talked about hydrocarbons as the defining strategic resource of the Middle East. But for me, that internal bleeding, that sort of longer, perhaps more pervasive bleeding out continue that metaphor, is really that for me, the region's most important constraint is water. And while oil remains the region's most valuable export, it's drinking water, in particular, that is becoming, and perhaps has always been, its most strategic vulnerability. And I don't want to be too negative here. I think because it's the most strategic vulnerability, I think there's the opportunity to create some of those. How do we stop the bleeding? How do we stop that slow bleeding internally, so that externally we can deal with the gash? Sort of triage, so to speak. Modern economies across the region in the Gulf have depended on energy-intensive water infrastructure and global food supply chains that are far more fragile than we wanted to witness. So we wanted to face that reality. Historically, societies in the Iranian highlands across the Gulf have adapted their water management through distributed systems designed around scarcity, right? The Qanat system, which is endemic to Afghanistan, to Iran, were really part of that decentralization of that infrastructure, so they could increase our resilience through that distributed system. Modern states, I think, have addressed water scarcity through centralized systems, such as desal plants, through dams, through long-distance pipelines, which have allowed cities in that region to grow way beyond their ecological limits. So these centralized water distribution systems are fantastic, except when they become single points of failure, which they're becoming quickly right now. And I'm looking forward to hearing what the rest of my panelists have to say on that point. So in this sense, modern infrastructure addressed water scarcity, but simultaneously created those new vulnerabilities. And then to pull the thread a little bit more on the shipping point, Iran and many countries in the region rely on global markets to supplement their domestic food production. So we know that disruptions in the Gulf, particularly around shipping routes, as in the Straits of Hormuz, affects fertilizer supply chains, right? And so, which underpin modern agriculture and can quickly translate into higher global food prices. So going back to water infrastructure, Many desal plants depend on large power stations to operate, meaning disruptions to energy infrastructure can quickly cascade into disruptions into drinking water supply. And so you're seeing this tightly coupled energy water system that's really difficult to protect during a conflict. And yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear ways of how we protect that, create that resilience. So for me, policymakers have to look at water infrastructure as well as fertilizer supply chains and food import dependence as critical components of regional security and also global security, right? Because what happens in the Gulf doesn't stay in the Gulf. I think for me, the key takeaway is that monitoring these systems may provide earlier signals of strategic stress than traditional indicators such as oil production or military activity, which we've sort of gone through, on the traditional national security side. And so if we focus on water scarcity and its interaction with water, energy, food, infrastructure, and geopolitics, I think we're able to start talking about how we create that resilience, how to maybe go back to some type of decentralization so that we can de-risk ourselves. Erin, I'll hand it back over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Swati. I mean, a lot in there. I really appreciate how you demonstrated the connections between the energy and the water systems, and also thinking about new ways to measure risk going forward and making sure that we're matching the threats we face today. That's really useful. Marcus King, let me turn it to you to talk more on the water issues in this area. Marcus, I think you're muted.
Marcus, you're muted.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry about that. So, our overarching topic today is the water, energy, food nexus, and really how the war fits into that. And so there's cascading risks that involve different parts of that nexus. And so energy, I think, has been fairly well covered already by Cullen. And we know a lot about energy, but I think both food and water are lesser known in how they interact with each other. So, in the area of food, we're likely to have a crop yield decline as water systems become less, they have less value and less ability to do that over time as they're degraded related to the war. We also have the disruption in fertilizer supply. So both urea that comes from the Gulf, but also especially the liquefied natural gas that is used in producing fertilizer is going to be a problem. So if you have areas that are both arid, maybe even by climate change impacts, and then areas where it's hard to get the fertilizer in and produced, that could really be an outcome that we wouldn't want to consider when it comes to food security. But also thinking about water from a water, energy, food perspective, I would say that the current conflict is affecting water security more indirectly than directly. The direct risk we've heard about in the last few days, there was an alleged U.S. strike on a desalination plant in southern Iran, which had, was connected to 30 communities there. But if you actually look at Iran and sort of the hydrology there, they do draw most of their water from pipelines, from dams, or from surface water, and they even have some decent access to aquifers. So desalination is only about 3% of the water usage in Iran. But also, Iran has struck out at Bahrain. So we know that has been verified, and there has been a desal plant that was hit in Bahrain by Iran. So those are the direct risks. But also, we have indirect risks of water stress in the area. And so, desalination disruptions, even if the plants aren't actually destroyed, will still cause most likely electricity shortages. Also, in water security, there's some emerging but really secondary effects. But this all depends on how long it lasts, right? So if the war goes on much further and more of the civilian infrastructure is depleted in Iran, Iran is already one of the most water stressed countries. We reached something that is called almost day zero, which was really the inability for municipal water to be piped into Tehran. And so what worries me is the idea that there's already groundwater depletion. There's already some mismanagement of water there, inefficient irrigation. If we see all of these things come together in a climate driven pattern, this could happen, let's say in the summer. So the summer's always been unbelievable temperatures. It's reached 130 degrees Fahrenheit in some areas in Iran, and that's essentially unlivable. So just thinking about that, and then also if there is damage to infrastructure, water treatment facilities rely on electricity for pumping. Water treatment plants rely on electricity and desalination. So I really think that the infrastructure damage will create urban vulnerabilities in the major cities in Iran. So I'm most worried about Iran, but also obviously the desal plants being destroyed in places like Bahrain is a huge problem because the Gulf countries and many cities in the Gulf countries rely on desal from about 60 to 90% of their water supplies. So we'll keep an eye on that. And thanks.
Great. Thanks, Marcus. I'm glad you brought up the desal plants, and we'll get to this in the Q&A. There are already some questions about is it a war crime? What are the risks of the targeting? How do we think about that? So we'll come back to that. Peter, let me turn it to you now.
Thank you, Erin. I'm going to talk a little bit about the broader climate and environmental context in which this war is happening in the region. And I've got sort of 4 points. I mean, of course, there is kind of an awful lot more one could cover. But sort of first point is that this war, and it feels sort of kind of insufficient to refer to it as a distraction, but in some ways it is another dangerous distraction from desperately needed climate and environmental action in the region. In a best case scenario, this is another few months in which sort of much needed climate adaptation and mitigation measures and kind of wider environmental sustainability efforts will not be put in place. And at worst, a very extended period in which already intense heat will become that bit more intense, already more frequent and more intense droughts will become that bit more prolific. I mean, for those of us living in the region, like there's an ever shrinking portion of the year in which temperatures and wider conditions are sort of genuinely hospitable. The sand and dust storm season in the Levant and parts of North Africa previously extended or kind of appeared in the sort of March to May window. Well, now you're getting sand and dust storms that can crop up at sort of practically any period of the year. So the very fact that, this is just another period in which climate and environment and sort of wider natural resource issues are getting pushed that bit further down the priority list is desperately miserable news. A second point is that if one looks at the list of countries that are the biggest military spenders in the world relative to GDP, half of them are in the region, in the GCC, Israel, and Jordan. And at a time when about 7 or 8, if not more, countries in the region have been directly afflicted by this conflict, it's extremely hard to see how that figure will go down, if not kind of further elevated. And the very fact that so much of this military and security sector spending comes, I mean, directly in many instances at the expense of environment and climate expenditure, and indeed wider education and healthcare spending, it is also a series of policy decisions that will likely have pretty prolific ramifications down the line. A third point is that while it might not necessarily seem to be the case when looking from outside, quietly and sort of bit by bit, we have, or at least had a series of kind of increasingly impressive transboundary water, environment, and climate initiatives, some public facing and some sort of discreet and behind the scenes, a number of which have involved Iran and Israel, both of which, of course, are sort of on the margins of regional affairs. And it seems kind of highly probable that high degree of transboundary cooperation will be, again, at best set back and at worst kind of compromised for an extended period. And the very fact that this conflict has sort of shone a very clear spotlight on the region's limitations, it's sort of really hammered home that on a water, energy, food basis, no state within the wider Middle East and North Africa can stand on its own 2 feet on those issues, really ought to be reinforcing the absolute necessity and vitality of that kind of transboundary cooperation. And yet the circumstances that we're seeing are absolutely not conducive to that. And then perhaps a fourth and final point, and it's sort of a loosely related one, which is that the kind of chaos, the kind of sort of headline grabbing or sort of dominating nature of this conflict is providing deeply unfortunate cover for a bunch of armed actors within the region, especially in Iraq, to clamp down on environmentalists and environmental causes that they see as threats to their kind of political power or threats to their financial bottom line. One of southern Iraq's leading environmental activists was detained 4 or 5 days ago, seemingly safe in the assumption that no one would kick up quite the same degree of fuss at a time like this. I mean, relatedly, one of Iraq's very top, if not top, women's activists was assassinated in Baghdad a few days ago. And the longer this continues, the more likely it is that we'll see abuses of this nature across the wider region.
Oh, thanks, Peter. That was really helpful. And I mean, I think your initial remarks too reminded me that, no country has the luxury in this day and age of dealing with just one threat at a time, right? Climate change doesn't pause while we work out the conflict in Iran, right? So your every day you lose of focus on that is another risk down the line that we're not prepared for. So thank you for that broader context. All right, Tom, turning to you now.
Sure. Thanks, Aaron, and thanks to all of our great panelists so far. I'll start. I'll just make a few points and reflections in reaction to all the great inputs everyone's had so far, and then I'll share a little bit based on some work that we at CCS have done on climate and water and food security in Iran from a year and a half or so ago. The first thing I wanted to put a pin in to come back to, right, is something that Colin was alluding to a little bit, and with this. Right, we have these food and energy shocks kind of rippling through the global economy at a time that is sensitive for both food security around planting seasons and also geopolitics. And we also have, the same time frame. About last month, scientists started telling us that El Nino is on the horizon and starting to shift, as best we can expect, to maybe transition from the La Nina phase we have been into more of an El Nino phase, a warmer El Nino phase, maybe around late summer or early fall, which is an extra bit of climate fuel on what will potentially be a vulnerable economic situation in terms of climate impacts and extreme weather impacts on those food and water and energy systems. And in fact, I know Colin himself has actually done some research on geopolitical risk and El Nino that, if I recall correctly, finds that the onset transition from La Nina to El Nino, introduces geopolitical risk globally on the order of similar to a new interstate war, if I'm not misstating that. So it's hard to believe that we've sort of been playing the climate game, so to speak, on relatively easy mode over the last year, but things are going, in a lot of places, especially drought and impacts on agriculture, are going to be picking up over the next year. The second piece I wanted to elaborate on too is just this aspect of food and energy crunches and conflicts afield around Ukraine and Europe, right? We talked a little bit about a potential, heating crisis, gas crunch in Europe, as well as the immediate energy impacts that they're seeing. And I think this is another area where we could potentially expect these issues to play out in terms of hybrid warfare and kind of jockeying for influence further afield, right? So we've already seen from the example of the Ukraine war and fallout, leading up to this Iran conflict, the way that Russia, for example, has tried to sort of weaponize concerns over energy costs or kind of differential impacts and views within the NATO alliance about energy costs or agricultural policy and Ukraine. Russia still has quite a bit of economic or trade leverage related to food and fuel, in places like the Caucasus or Turkey, right? Or influence efforts in Africa, countries that will be heavily affected by food and fuel impacts. So I would kind of put those out on the table for other panelists to jump in on. The other point I wanted to address is just this kind of longer term climate and water security picture in Iran. As other people have said, climate change is nowhere near the cause of this conflict in Iran, right? But I think if you were looking at climate and water in Iran to, again, extend the car crash analogy, that might be more like the chronic illness, right, that has been going on in the background of Iran for decades, right? Iran has had this sort of water security crisis building for decades because of mismanagement and increasingly looking forward climate change, to the point where the capital Tehran was under discussion about being relocated because of water insecurity even before this conflict, and had been the source of this kind of some of this promising kind of back channel regional cooperation that Peter was discussing. And also that has driven protests at times, not so much the most recent round of protests, but protests over water security and agriculture issues in Iran that has produced state violence. So that is a background factor that is going to still be there for whatever comes out of this conflict in Iran. Whatever kind of governance emerges in Iran is still going to have this worsening problem that is going to be exacerbated going forward by climate change. And additionally to that, I mean, a lot of that agricultural mismanagement and water overuse is driven by Iran's place in the regional order, right? Iran really prioritizes domestic food self-sufficiency because of how isolated and threatened it feels. So it uses a lot of water to achieve that, even if it's inefficient, right? Sanctions shape some of its access or lack thereof to more efficient water and food technologies, right? So the IRGC's economic interest driven dam building, all these things that are kind of, no one can know where it will land, but some of these assumptions about the regional order have had kind of a hand grenade thrown into them. So depending on where they land, it could shape any of those incentives for I mean, right now it seems more like for worse, but also potentially in better or different ways, depending on how things shake out.
Thanks so much, Tom. Really, really useful. We have so many good questions already in the Q&A, but I'm going to take moderator's privilege for one before we turn to those. If we were having a webinar like this in March of 2022, the title would have been The War in Ukraine, Implications for Food and Energy Security, maybe not water quite as much. But I wanted to ask the panelists to reflect, right? How do you see the food and energy shocks from this conflict differing from the Russian invasion of Ukraine? Are there similarities? Are there lessons we should be learning from that conflict? Just how do we put this in that broader context over the past 5-6 years here? And Cullen, I'm going to turn to you first, and then whoever else wants to jump in.
Okay, well, I mean, that's an incredibly complex question, so I'll just tackle a small part of it. So, right, when we think about the current circumstances, we're talking about the Persian Gulf, the broader Middle East. We're talking about a region that, as anybody who's looking at a globe or a map currently will be able to tell you, is very arid. It has relatively high population relative to sort of its prevalence of arable land. So it's highly import dependent. So I think in our current moment, what we're seeing is an issue of availability of supply and less in terms of a supply shock emanating from, say, a failed harvest, but more thinking about the difficulties, right, in the logistics of moving the food from the exporting countries to the importing countries that need to consume it. Back in 2022, we were looking at something very different. We were looking at two of the central pillars of the world grain market, in particular for wheat, but then also for oats, barley, some millet, some of these other types of exported grains. There, you had the weaponization of those exports in the form of attacks on infrastructure, similar to what we saw in the 80s in the tanker war, which is one of the pathways that could develop here in the Iran crisis situation. So that's just a little piece of it. To just that the first time around, it was a shock that affected big pillars of the export market. Now it's a shock that's facing big pillars of the import market. But of course, as I mentioned earlier, those energy prices anchor prices for virtually everything else that is downstream of that. And therefore, more generally, it's going to have an inflationary effect on food prices for all of us.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, part of the reason I wanted to bring it up is I think, we every time a shock like this happens, we say, okay, now is when we're all going to understand that systemic risk, right, is a thing, that we need to build better resilience. I'm not sure we learned that lesson. And obviously the contexts are different, but I think worth thinking about a little bit. Anybody else want to jump in on that before we move to the Q&A box?
Yeah, just really quickly for me, just I think Cullen laid out really neatly sort of the differences. But for me, I think the real value is like, what do we learn from Ukraine, and what are we not doing, or what should we be doing here? And I think the lesson from Ukraine was that governments the global economy shouldn't wait for full cutoff before acting, right? I mean, I think that's what we tend to do. We tend to wait for the urgent to, which is here. It's that visceral, it's that bleeding, right? And then you ignore the internal bleeding because you can't see it, right? Which is like where I would put sort of the water conversation and that chronic sleep insomnia, right? It becomes, it's a problem, right? You can ignore it until all of a sudden systems shut down. You can't any function. So in the Ukraine, I think, sorry, going back to the Gulf conversation, I think the real damage comes from price volatility, that panic buying and some of the export restrictions that could come as a result of what's happening in that current crisis. I think another lesson from me is that countries with diversified suppliers, diversification, right? And better reserves, stronger social protections that absorbs shocks much better than countries that are relying on a narrow set of trade routes or imported staples, I think is really the key takeaway. And again, like, how are we applying that here? I don't know.
Thanks. All right, I'm going to move to the Q&A box. There's, like I said earlier, there's a couple of questions about the attacks on desalination facilities and the assertion of this as a war crime. And interested in folks' views on that, and also, do these attacks create future risk of making these acceptable targets for various actors for a wider region? Maybe Marcus, can I ask you to comment first, and then anyone else who'd like to?
Yeah, absolutely. So the idea of deliberately targeting civilian infrastructure is prohibited both by international humanitarian law and also the rules of war. So the Geneva Protocol's additional Protocol 1, says that all civilian infrastructure, including water infrastructure, water treatment plants, and even dams, cannot be used as a tool of war. I've studied this, and I've seen that it does tend to occur in the Middle East more than other places. So where we've seen some of this was during the Iran-Iraq War, for example. We've also seen the Houthis in Yemen bomb a few of the facilities in Saudi Arabia. And even the unfortunate situation in Gaza, where they rely on desalination, 3 desalination plants that have been sporadically available depending on what's been happening there. So, it is prescribed by the laws of war. Subnational actors, though, don't tend to see themselves subject to those laws. So that's a problem. But then there's also a wider treaty that many state actors belong to, which is the Environmental Modification Treaty. And so, again, that prohibits modifying the environment in a way that might be done again is through infrastructure like dams. So you cannot release the water from the dams, and we saw this actually also in the Russo-Ukrainian context during their war. So I don't necessarily see it slowing down, but there are those prohibitions under international laws of war and also humanitarian law.
Thanks, Marcus. Anybody else on the desal plants?
Can I just wanted to say one very brief thing. I mean, Marcus, I think you're absolutely right to focus on the fact that there are more actors that are going to be involved in this conflict than just the headline ones that you would get from thinking about this as a purely interstate kind of war. So yes, focusing on the potential for non-state actors to attack civilian-oriented infrastructure in order to sort of increase the pressure, maybe thinking, from an accelerationist kind of perspective, is something that we need to watch out for. But I think it's also been made very clear by the U.S. Secretary of Defense that the United States has announced that it is not particularly interested in following established rules of engagement or complying with international law. And so I don't think that we need to be thinking about this risk vector as one that is completely the domain of non-state actors.
Yeah, thanks. I need to challenge our assumptions there. Peter, did you want to comment on this? Yeah.
Yeah, really just going to sort of add to what Marcus and Cullen had previously said. I mean, in the Middle East in particular, norms against the targeting of water-related infrastructure have very much broken down, and I think there was perhaps a near inevitability to the way in which desalination facilities have been kind of brought into the conflict. I mean, of course, 3 years ago, the Houthis targeted a Saudi desalination facility on the Red Sea. Indirectly, at least, the Israelis have stifled the way in which Gaza's desalination facilities operate. And so, in that kind of political climate, this was just a sort of a disaster waiting to happen. I mean, but to briefly roll this into the Ukraine war comparison, it's striking how one of Kyiv's takeaways from the conflict was the absolute necessity of diffusing its previously highly concentrated energy infrastructure. One of the reasons why that country has been more successful than one might expect in kind of keeping the lights on amid sort of prolific Russian airstrikes is a rapid rollout in solar. And one of the things I'm going to be watching for when this conflict sort of hopefully comes to an end is what the Gulf states in particular make of their sort of newfound acute vulnerability with desalination facilities. As Swati very sagely brought up earlier, these highly concentrated systems are just that bit more vulnerable to the sort of quote unquote more traditional kind of water operating systems that states have abided by. Now, of course, there's a slight difference in that there's a limit to how far the Gulf states in particular can go to sort of wean themselves off these new choke points. But I really hope it's been processed as a threat that simply cannot continue in this current state.
Thanks. I mean, on that point, I'm going to ask another question, and this was particularly for Swati, but others can jump in. Of like, where do you go from here if you're in the region? It's a question of how does the region go back to a more decentralized water system, smaller neighborhood scale desal plants, anything else? I mean, Peter just gave us some thoughts there, but do you have additional thoughts, Swati?
Yeah, so many thoughts. Thanks, Erin, and thanks for that question. But time permitting, I think for me, the best investments, decentralization for me is the name of the game here. And the best investments are ones that reduce exposure to both acute geopolitical shocks, such as what we're seeing right now, that over-reliance on these single points of failure, i.e. these huge desal plants, as well as chronic climate stress. And I think it's that second piece that we often miss. And that's why I think Tom's point about El Nino is particularly important here, because for me, time and time again, like we miss El Nino as an opportunity to create that medium-term resilience, which is what we need to be doing right now. You know, like, yes, we need to be protecting the environmental activists during the time of war, but like also El Nino is happening, and also what are we doing about it? And I think this part of the conversation is gets dropped off. So, okay, a couple of ways. One, I think water efficiency, leakage reduction are high investments, right? High value investments. They improve resilience even when whether the problem is drought or conflict or rising energy costs, so you're buying back some risk there. Second, I think that the distributed and more resilient energy systems can help reduce that vulnerability of the centralized infrastructure and keep water and food systems functioning despite the disruption, right? Third, I think modern storage, logistics, and transport resilience for food and agricultural inputs can cushion both conflict and climate-related supply volatility. I would also include climate-smart agriculture and fertilizer efficiency in those points because they reduce your exposure to both input price spikes as well as worsening environmental stress. And then probably the fourth thing fourth thing is investments in early warning, contingency planning. We have those. We're just not using them, I think, during war or conflict, rather, because we're focused on minimizing the conflict as opposed to how are we rebuilding, right? Because it will end. We don't know when, but we need to focus on that almost immediately. So what does that contingency planning, what does the institutional coordination look like? And so for me, the countries that do best in these situations, right, are not the ones with no exposure, because we can't do that. We can't live in a bubble, but it's the ones that can see the interconnections early and respond before those market shocks and become political crises.
Yeah, thanks, Swati. That's really helpful. Tom, I want to come to you. There was a question in the chat, and Colin very helpfully posted his piece about El Nino. But can you expand on the comments you made about the potential developing El Nino? How could this impact countries that are likely to experience El Nino-induced drought versus induced flood? You know, what could countries do to be preparing? So, Tom, I'll let you kick that off, and then others join in.
Ooh. Sure. So, so generally during an El Nino cycle, you have a higher global temperature on average, right? So over the past the most recent El Nino was when we got the hottest year on record. A lot of climate scientists have now started seeing this shift now from this cooler El Nino, excuse me, this cooler La Nina period we've been in, starting to shift back towards a warmer El Nino, and there are various projections about when that might happen. That best I can tell, a lot of people are talking about later in the summer, but that brings a higher temperature and depending on the geography, right, different increased risk of extreme weather around drought and flood, things that can impact food. One of the forms of extreme weather that's more acute in La Nina, as an aside, is hurricanes that might affect the U.S. And we sort of got lucky this year that we didn't have a major hurricane land on the mainland U.S. But I think as it relates to that, it gets back to something that Swathi was pointing out about these win-win investments in less centralized and vulnerable and more kind of dispersed and robust resources, whether it's fertilizers or water or renewables versus fossil fuels, right? That they bring resilience to disruptions, whether it's from a military attack or a trade shock or a drought or a hurricane or some kind of climate related disaster. But something that I'm concerned about as it relates to that coming El Nino we're in for, right, is that it brings that increased likelihood that we'll see getting more and more likely over time with climate change, of things like crop failures and other especially food related disruptions that could sort of heighten and turbocharge, the price shocks and things that we might be seeing from this conflict. And as drawing on my own background, right, it makes me think of things like the Arab Spring, right, which among many things, one of the contextual factors there was, price spikes from crop failures around the world of the type we will get more of from climate change. If you recall, Egyptian protesters with, bread, chanting bread, right? That was a piece of that, right? And many of those most vulnerable countries to that kind of shock are also in the Middle East, right, as well as elsewhere, as Colin said. But places in North Africa, for example, a lot of Gulf countries themselves, elsewhere, are very dependent on imports for food and very sensitive to those kinds of shocks. So I would be keeping an eye on the real experts on climate forecasting, right, about that coming shift towards El Nino.
Mm-hmm. May I just add one thing on that?
Go ahead.
No, I think, one of the nice things about the El Nino is that there's a predictable geography of the effects, both on the dry side and the wet side. And so my standard answer for this would be, okay, we can use that form of intelligence, right, to think about pre-positioning disaster relief, but then also emergency food aid so that it's already in theater. So there's not a lag between when the need comes online and then the boats are on a vessel that may or may not have to, to traverse the Strait of Hormuz. The problem with that is that we are in a moment where the United States has retreated from its traditional role as the main pillar of emergency food assistance. You're seeing decreased contributions from allies in Europe that are related to increased military spending that is related to the war in Ukraine. The current circumstances are not going to tame, I think, those kind of tendencies significantly. So we are going into, or we are in the first quarter of 2026 in a circumstance where the World Food Program is down almost a full third from where they should be in terms of their funding in order to address these kinds of problems. And also, they're going to have to be moving into spot markets, potentially for some of these grains that are going to be at elevated prices because of the energy security challenges.
Yeah, so just at a time when we need more resources, we have fewer than ever before. Well, maybe not ever, but at least in recent memory. Okay, I'm going to move on to I'm going to combine two additional questions here and turn to Peter and Marcus to kick us off. One is, what scale of migratory pressure could you see in the region due to prolonged conflict in Iran, based on the potential food and water unavailability challenges? So that's one. And a related question is around the transboundary nature of the rivers in the region and the conflict dynamics. what concrete steps could regional governments and international organizations be taking now to prepare for potential humanitarian pressures, again, around those shared water resources or just the potential migration challenges broadly. So, Peter, can I turn to you and then I'll turn to Marcus?
Yeah, I mean, so much hinges on how long this conflict lasts.
Yeah.
The longer it goes, the greater the economic destruction in Iran, the longer or the more blows that the country's water, energy, and food systems sustain, the harder it will be to sort of piece the place back together, and the greater the flows of people arriving on its neighbors' doorsteps. But I mean, it's important to note that Iran itself hosts several million largely Afghan refugees, many of whom are having an increasingly difficult time there, and many of whom are already looking for the exits. I mean, as I think many of you likely saw in the week preceding this particular Iran centered conflict, Afghanistan and Pakistan sort of briefly ish did battle over Iran's eastern border, and that conflict has every chance of sort of flaring up again at some point soon. And as I mean, Aaron and others have mentioned, I mean, every single one of the outstanding humanitarian appeals in the region is already woefully underfunded. I think the Syria Reconstruction Fund, whose total needs have very conservatively been placed at about $216 billion, has thus far received pledges well under 10% of that. And when it comes to kind of Syria focused humanitarianism, you're really looking at an effort that's maximum 10% funded. So, I mean, God forbid if this humanitarian crisis reaches a level many times greater than it already has, who knows what sorts of kind of pennies and cents will be available to deal with it. And one can imagine, especially on the Iran Turkey border, which has been the locus of kind of much of the Iranian migratory movement thus far, one could imagine that many refugees and would-be migrants will face an even more militarized, even more securitized response than they have thus far.
Thanks, Peter. Marcus?
Yeah, so I think Peter really covered the potential impacts on migration in sort of the immediate region. But something that I'm worried about, I was thinking about, is just the idea that there will be migratory pressures related to this overall water, energy, food crisis in other parts of the world. A couple areas I outlined already that might have increased food insecurity, like South Asia, for example, some of the countries there, due to their dependence on fertilizers again, and increasing climate stress coming together, there might be more migration, say, even between Bangladesh and India or Pakistan, which was already mentioned as well. Another semi-regional part would be the idea of Egypt. I mean, if it's becoming more dry there, again, climate impacts like saline intrusion into the narrow agricultural zone around the Nile Delta and up the Nile River, that might spark a little bit more pressure on migration to, say, Southern Europe even. And then also parts of Africa that might become more impoverished due to the regional issues surrounding food supply and availability. So there's some areas that are, secondary to this exact geography that Peter was talking about as well. And then in terms of transboundary rivers, there aren't any in the immediate vicinity of the Gulf. But as I had said before, the Iranians do, rely upon surface water that comes from certain rivers. So that's a thing. And so, part of the answer to that, of course, would be trying to improve ways to get water other than surface waters, right? So aquifers, more efficient use of irrigation would take off a little bit of that pressure from the surface waters as well. And then, also a little bit further afield, there is, of course, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam and that question, which isn't directly related, but the idea, again, of what are some of the impacts of the cutting off of supply of water for the downstream riparian, in this case, Egypt, which again could play into migratory pressures and food insecurity, depending on what the relationship is with the Ethiopians having filled the dam already.
Thanks so much, Marcus. I appreciate throughout all this conversation, there's been a lot of good discussion of other parts of the world that are going to face second or third order impacts from this conflict. I want to come back home for a second. We've got a question about what this cascading impacts we might expect to see in the United States as the situation unfolds. So not the first order, rising gas prices, but instead, second and third order effects here. I'll open that to anybody on the panel who might want to take that briefly, and then we'll do this question, and then I'll come back with one final question that will go through all the panelists, and we'll wrap things up. Am I going to have to call on somebody? Go for it, Tom.
I can maybe share some, some thoughts. I think one comparison, right, to the coming out of similar or potentially similar kind of global price and economic shocks from COVID and the Ukraine war, right, was just a general kind of around the world anti-incumbency type of strengthening, right, about dissatisfaction with prices. And so, that the oil price spikes and gasoline is a part of that. But depending on how this shakes out, that could also potentially play out here. I think the other big picture kind of wild card question and difference from Ukraine, right, is that like this conflict, rather than being instigated by Russia invading Ukraine and having the kind of expected effect you might think of that within NATO and other things, right, this is a conflict more instigated by the United States and Israel, and then other kind of traditional U.S. allies are kind of having to react and balance to that in their own different ways. So depending on how the conflict plays out, it could shape U.S. ally and partner kind of perceptions of the United States further, in the context of the wider ways that the Trump administration has been, kind of quite volatile and transactional with traditional allies. But again, that's all very dependent on how things shake out.
Sure. So much of this is, right? Okay, well, there's one question in here from a couple different people that I'm going to ask all panelists to comment on it and then provide kind of your wrap-up remarks. And Swathi, maybe I'll turn to you first, and you can, if you want to jump in on what Tom said, go right ahead. But the question is, will the current conflict accelerate the global transition from fossil fuels, or in the short term reinforce hydrocarbon dependence? And there's another question along those lines. Will it delay or accelerate the energy transition? You don't have to answer that directly, but I guess what I would ask is, what signposts or indicators would you look for that we were moving in one direction or the other, right? What would show you, and what might make it more likely that we would move in one direction or the other as a result of this conflict? So I'll turn that to you all, and any other final thoughts you have on everything that we've talked about today. And Swathi, I'll let you go first.
Oh, great. I was volunteering for the different answer, but I'm giving my panelists the benefit of time to get their answers ready for the very important wrap-up session. So you're welcome, everyone. But just to really flip it, perhaps, but I think also it has a benefit to your earlier question about how does this affect us here in the U.S. I do think that there's more of a cognizance of the American public on the impact of geopolitics on their everyday lives, right? Whether it's translation through what I'm paying at the gas pump, right? Or just the awareness of how what happens in the Gulf affects me in Ohio. I'm not in Ohio, but you just go with me here. I think that is becoming much more of a reality. And I do think that more and more companies are seeing geopolitical risk as a job opportunity, right? And public utilities are now hiring for geopolitical risk analysts. So I think that there's some benefits that come out of that. And so maybe it's job creation. Okay, but in terms of wrapping up and what are those signposts? I think for me, signposts would be redundancy. I think for too far, redundancy has been bastardized as something that's inefficient and woefully out of step of how markets should be increasingly efficient. And I'm very aware Cohen is on this panel, and he's sort of an economist here. So, but I think if we can prioritize the transition through redundancy, right? How are we reducing over-reliance upon single suppliers, single routes, single facilities? How are we diversifying food sourcing? How are we creating more distributed integrated water systems were feasible, better electricity reliability. How are we improving storage? How do we have stronger contingency planning between energy, water, and agriculture? I think are those signposts. I think, in terms of like the transition away, I think for too long we've prioritized resilience as something that's long term, and we need to talk about what's happening here in terms of how are we creating that structural resilience. How are we investing in governance and infrastructure that reduces that systemic fragility, which is sort of your opening salvo, Aaron, and creating those better water management, more efficient irrigation. How are we reducing our reliance on the grid, right? And looking at creating those redundancies. So I'll pause there to hand it off to the rest of the panelists who will hopefully answer that more eloquently.
Oh, don't undersell yourself, Swati. You were very eloquent. Let me turn it to Peter next.
Well, yeah, thank you, Swati. I've got to live up to your demand there now. I mean, we do have, as I think everybody knows, strong or strongish precedent from other parts of the world in which fossil fuel related crisis in, for example, Pakistan, in, for example, Cuba right now, in, for example, Nigeria, does give rise to a dramatically accelerated rollout in solar in particular. And I think it entirely possible, and well, hopefully likely, that the current crisis will shine an additional spotlight upon our kind of acute kind of oil and gas related vulnerability, and thereby give rise to an even greater interest in solar. I say that with greater pause and caution than I previously would have, because I've seen plenty of sort of crises come and go without the sort of changes that one would expect. But it's a sort of a bit of a watch this space. I mean, while I would hope for a degree of positivity on the kind of renewables front, sort of emerging out of this crisis, in a Middle Eastern food context, I'm much more dispirited. My fear, as has been kind of alluded to on a number of occasions over the course of the last hour, is that, I mean, the Middle East has this long tradition of kind of food self-sufficiency in Iran, in Saddam-era Iraq, in Assad-era Syria. And the very fact that kind of food imports are at this point threatened, and were the war to escalate, quite possibly menaced to an even greater degree, I fear will lead to kind of a kind of increased interest on the part of many regional states in growing even more food than they currently do, and even more food than their already meager water resources will sustain. So when we come to looking at the kind of the long-term resource picture, I think there's a strong degree of sort of potential good news on the energy front, which may well be kind of mimicked by a strong kind of series of risks on the food front.
Thanks, Peter. Cullen?
Short term, I think it's probably very short term. It's bad for energy transitions, but I'm actually taking a pretty bullish position on the longer term effects for a couple of reasons. One, this is no way to live for Europe and for East Asia in particular, having their energy security essentially dictated by security interactions that are occurring around them and not directly involving them. And the second reason is just that LNG was supposed to be the safe bridge technology to a future powered by renewables. And what we're finding out is it actually, at this point, oil is much more safely geographically diversified than LNG is. And so this safe bridge technology is looking less safe, structurally speaking. And I do think that that is going to accelerate the energy transitions, at least in East Asia and Europe.
Thanks, Cullen. Marcus?
Okay, well, I'll sacrifice some eloquence here in terms to be a little more brief, because I see the hour we're at. So brevity over eloquence. I agree a lot with Cullen, which is the idea that this crisis reinforces hydrocarbon dependence. So first it was the idea of Russian, oil and gas being trapped, and now, of course, it's the idea of the blockage at the Strait of Hormuz. So one thing I'm thinking might be a result is this might increase demand for U.S. Produced LNG and oil as being the largest producer in the world. So I think that kind of feeds, unfortunately, the narrative of drill, baby, drill, in this case for the U.S. In the short term. But in the long term, People have to have learned from the dual crises of the trapped LNG from Russia and the current crisis. And so over time, I think the next few years, we will see more push for things like distributed renewables in other countries. So I'm bullish on the long run here. And then finally, just in terms of my final remarks, I would just say, just remember that we're talking about the food, energy, water intersection in this nexus, and really the idea of almost having to play whack-a-mole where one thing exacerbates another. So, energy shocks are driving up fertilizer costs, which are driving up food prices. Energy disruptions and desalination constraints are harming water security. And then water security in the food areas relating to agricultural decline. So just remembering that all these feedback loops put together make a primary military conflict that seems short and discrete into larger socio and even ecological crises.
Thanks so much for connecting all of those pieces together. That's really useful. Tom, last word, very briefly.
Yeah, very briefly, I guess I would say, I mean, one big difference from Ukraine is that in this situation, Ukraine has already happened just recently, right? And so now this is the second in a row. And so I would hope that one lesson to come away to Colin's point is that, right, we try, like Europe, for example, leaned, in addition to renewables, leaned into US and Middle East LNG in some cases. And now look where, that now they're dealing with sort of the geopolitical risks of that, right? So I think that gets to the point of we need to diversify off of fossil fuels, not just diversify the suppliers of it. And so one indicator I would be looking for is like how much does the short-term response create positive or negative kind of lock-in or not for fossil fuels going forward, right? Like turning a coal plant back on for a few days to keep the lights on is one thing versus, creating a new LNG pipeline and decades-long contract is another. So overcoming those short-term incentives that act against renewables, I think, and how it's done, if it's done in a way that also brings about long-term investment in these more resilient technologies, that's the thing I would look for.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. Thanks for the excellent questions in the question box. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. You just had too much good, interesting things to say. Thanks to the panelists. I hope we've all gotten a little bit better sense of how to think about these challenges going forward. And would love to do this again in another couple months to kind of check and see where we're at and talk maybe more on the solutions side a little bit. Although I think we did a lot of that today too. So thanks again to everybody. Please stay in touch with the center, and we'll be posting this online in the next day or so. So thank you again.